It's match day's eve as Mikel Arteta faces the press ahead of Arsenal's game against Liverpool tomorrow on Sunday. We've got to discuss it all in today's Arsenal News Show. Hello and welcome to the Gooner Talk, back again with you guys and girls for another episode of what is our Arsenal News Show, joining you every single morning at 8 o'clock UK time. Thank you as always for joining me and making this a part of your morning routines. Different surroundings this morning, of course, so hoping that the audio is fine, the internet is fine, and you can still hear me and see me as clearly as feasibly possible. I'm on a different camera today, so there's probably going to be some slight graining compared to the usual, so forgive me for that. But if you could drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, that would be massively appreciated. Good morning to those joining us live in the chat box. Damien, Arasilki, Mubarak, Matt, Paul in the chat box as well. Louis, Clincy, Glenn, Steve, Rancid, Angela, Temi, Matt G, Black Shine, Edison, Amira and Stevie. Good morning to you all and plenty of you others as well joining us in the chat. Thank you as always for doing so. And just a reminder that tomorrow morning, it's a couple of reminders actually, tomorrow the clocks go back here in the UK. So for those not based inside the UK, the time of the 8 a.m. show will be changing. So just bear that in mind. With it going back here, I imagine that means that it's, I think, an hour earlier or an hour later. You'll work it out. It's one of the two. Just give it a Google and it'll come up for you, I'm sure. But here in the UK, the clocks are going back an hour. So, of course, that means that tomorrow morning show, which is actually a pre-recorded episode of the preview show ahead of the game against Liverpool, will be going out. Well, for those that are based in the UK, it will feel like an hour earlier, but of course will still technically be 8 o'clock. So yeah, just make sure you bear that in mind. And for the shows going forward, also bear that in mind for any of the games that you're going to be watching. If you're based outside of the UK as well, with the clocks going backwards, it means that the games are going to be at very different times for you guys and girls out there. So make sure you check that out. But without further ado, let's jump into today's stories. And we start with Sambi Lokonga, actually, who got an assist yesterday in Sevilla's game against Espanyol. It's one of those assists that are relatively easy to come by for yourself when you just play a simple pass a few yards, and the player that you pass it to, being in this case Luca Bacchio, smacks the ball in from about 30 yards. But Lokonga is back. Of course, he's had a few struggles at Sevilla on loan. He's been out with a number of injuries, but seems to finally be getting his Sevilla career underway. He said in his press conference when he joined the club that he hoped to stay there for a long time. It's only a one-year loan, so you'd imagine that hints towards perhaps a permanent deal in the summer, but he's going to need to be able to do this on a regular occasion and start more games if he's going to be able to justify Sevilla getting that money through the door to Arsenal in the summer. There's an option, I think, of around £10 million or so to make that deal permanent. Arne Slot discovered a press conference in which he was not going to be giving any good news to their supporters, because he confirmed that Diogo Jota will indeed be out for the game against Arsenal on Sunday. He discussed a number of other things, but he did outright confirm that Jota would not be there. A number of other players have got some late fitness tests to see if they're going to be available, but Jota, who has a fantastic record, of course, against Arsenal, it's very good for us that he isn't going to be there in tomorrow's game, because I imagine he probably would have started, which means that one of either Darwin Nunez, who started their midweek game, or of course Cody Gakpo, you'd imagine, will be starting at centre forwards with Luis Diaz and Mohamed Salah in the wide areas. Salah came off around 73 minutes, I think it was, maybe slightly earlier than that in the game in midweek, as Liverpool narrowly beat RB Leipzig. So he's fully rested. He'll be available and ready for the game against Arsenal. But Arsenal as well have got some fitness questions. And Mikel Arteta did indeed take his press conference yesterday afternoon. He was asked about Saka, Calafiori and Timber. The questioning at the start of the press conference was very much angled around people's fantasy teams. If you listened along to it, of course, you can watch that back on the Arsenal website. You can read all of the text on the football.london website as well. But when asked about players like Saka and Calafiori and Timber, he says, we're going to do our very best to somehow have them available, but it's very uncertain. He was pressed a bit further on Calafiori's injury, to which he said he needs some more tests. Yesterday he had some, and today he's going to have some more, that being, of course, Friday afternoon. And after that, we will know. Last time we thought it was really bad, and he ended up playing 2 or 3 days afterwards. So let's see how it is. He was asked if he would make Sunday's game, and he says, I said the last time it happened, but this time it might be different. Very keen not to give too much away, as we've come to expect from Arteta in these press conferences. He didn't use the usual line where he says there's another training session still to go, so we'll have to wait and see. But I don't think we can expect too many. Interestingly, he was actually asked a question around leaks. You may or may not have been aware of the leaks that were going on around Arsenal at the start of his tenure, and a lot of kind of suggestions about who might be leaking information to, certain social media accounts or certain journalists. He was actually asked a number of questions about those leaks, and he says, especially for the team news, that's something I understand. A lot of kids as well want to do their own teams and be managers in their position for fantasy football, and it is our job to protect that as much as possible, because you don't want to give anything away, and so it's normal. And he was asked questions about Bukayo Saka, more specifically, and he says yes, he has done a bit of training on the grass. How far we can get him to Sunday, that's a different question, and we have another day, which is a good thing, but we will see. I think that there's a lot of optimism that is growing that Saka will indeed be available for the game on Sunday. But you can't take anything for granted. And there's a good opportunity, of course, that he might only make the bench, in which case we're going to have to deal with that absence and bring in a player like Raheem Sterling or Gabriel Jesus. They're going to have to step up. They're going to have to get opportunities to play at some time in the season when we need to rotate. And even though it's a massive game, we need to be able to rely on somebody to do that job if it's not Saka. The other player, of course, was Jurrien Timber. And he says Timber, again, it's the first session that he could have done or had some involvement. He's been out for a while, and we expected him to be further back than where he was at the moment. But again, we have to wait and see. So confirming there that Timber has indeed done some work on the grass, had a session yesterday, had a session maybe on Thursday as well. But it'll be very touch and go to see whether or not he's back. There's a lot of suggestions by people online that they feel that, considering the magnitude of this game, that they may indeed to rush them back. But in this case, you are taking a risk, and Arsenal have got some huge games coming up. Yes, there's an away game against Preston on Wednesday that doesn't look too huge, but then when you look past that to Newcastle away, Chelsea away, Inter Milan away, there are some huge games for Arsenal, and we need to make sure that we're not risking too much just for one game. But when you consider that if Arsenal lose this, they will be 7 points behind Liverpool, that gap suddenly becomes quite considerable. We can reduce the gap of how much that you need to pay if you want to get involved with our latest sponsorship, which is, of course, with NordVPN. You can get a significant discount off a 1 or a 2 year plan and get 4 months extra free on top of that 2-year deal by going to nordvpn.com/Gooner. You can get yourself that deal. It's an absolute must to have a VPN in 2024, whether you're using a public Wi-Fi service. For instance, I'm staying at a hotel right now, which is using public Wi-Fi. So making sure that you've got a VPN turned on so anyone else accessing that Wi-Fi service doesn't have access to your data is very important. And you need to change geolocation. Perhaps you're going abroad and you want to use a VPN service to hop back digitally to the UK on your tablet or your laptop or indeed your mobile device. Of course, it gives you the ability to do that as well in any of the territories that are supported by Nord. So that's nordvpn.com/Gooner. Go down to the link in the description. Go and get yourself a significant discount off a 1 or a 2 year plan. Well, let's go to part 2 and your questions right after this. Right, part 2 of the show, where we are going to be taking some of your questions for the next 10 or so minutes. John says that the feed's a bit fuzzy. Apologies for the Wi-Fi. I can't control that. We're here in a hotel this weekend, as I mentioned on yesterday's show. Having a bit of a detox weekend away, just taking yourself away from work, definitely need a bit of a recharge. So do forgive me for that. Tomorrow morning's show will be the usual surroundings, because it is a pre-recorded preview for the game against Liverpool. So make sure you tune in for that. Just be aware that, of course, myself and Mike, who did the show, of course, didn't have any of the information from the press conference when we did the show, but we did kind of talk about that in hypothetical terms. So it should still all be very much relevant when you listen to it tomorrow. Right, jump into some of your questions in the chat. Ben Erland says, do you think that you can improve your score to beat the guy who won day 1 on the Lads Open yesterday? I absolutely do. Thank you to Ben. Make sure you're dropping a like on the video, mate. John says, no clocks going back here means that the later for the Australians as well as anyone else around the world. So I guess with the clocks going back, it means that if you watch the show at a certain time, add another hour. It seems to be that's how it works. What John says in the chat. Thank you, John. James says, "Hi Tom. Partey's recent form gives me a lot of hope for tomorrow, and I'm replacing him next season. He's going to be very tough. There are question marks, of course, about whether or not to start Thomas Partey in a right back position because we don't know if Jurrien Timber's going to be back. We also don't have Calafiori. Even if we have Timber back, some people might decide to play Partey at right back. Some people might decide to play Timber at right back and move him into the midfield, bring Kivior into the left back position, or use Zinchenko. There is a number of options that we can, of course, go with." Jean says, question, is it possible that Arteta actually hesitates to use Waneri more because of all the injuries? He wants him to play with our best players when he starts. I kind of understand where your question's coming from in the sense of, do you throw a player in when you've got all the players that are going to be around to support him with the highest level of quality? And maybe that's why he's holding off a little bit too much. But yeah, I still think that there's been games like against Southampton, like against Leicester, even Shakhtar, where I think we could have started Waneri and probably not had too much of a problem. Boss says, when is Saliba going to be back? Saliba, of course, is only suspended for this game against Liverpool, so he'll be back for Preston. He can play against Newcastle. There's no issues there. He's only going to be out for this one game. Matt says, Tom, how many goalkeepers do you think Arsenal will buy in the summer? Goalies seem to be Arteta's thing at the moment. Well, of course, Neto is only on loan for this season. I think Arsenal will be going out into the market to try and bring in a more permanent number two. They were very interested in Joan Garcia of Espanyol in the summer, but his price tag at the end of the window was too expensive for them to commit to, but it may be different later on in 2025. They may choose to go for a goalkeeper in January. Of course, they were interested in signing another third choice keeper during that period. I think it was the Wigan goalkeeper that they were looking at, Sam Tickle, they were interested in, but he ultimately decided to stay with Wigan and ultimately will stay there for the foreseeable future, it seems. But a 22-year-old keeper, of course, I think he is moving to be a third choice at Arsenal. It's not the best choice for your career at that age. You think you need to be playing, so you can understand why he perhaps wasn't keen on the move at that time. Fergus says, Tom, what would your preferred back four be tomorrow, given the injuries and suspensions? Well, if you tune into tomorrow's preview show, you'll be able to find out my preferred back four and Mike's, of course, preferred back four as well. So Fergus, make sure you're tuning into tomorrow's preview show. John says, Tom, is Gyökeres still pulling up trees in Portugal? I mean, he has a very good season. He scored again in midweek for Sporting in the Champions League as they beat Sturm Graz away from home. So yes, he still had a very decent season. And if this continues, I think Arsenal will be joining the race among other teams to be potentially looking to sign him in the summer. Let's scroll up in the chat a little bit more, because I know there's probably some questions I missed prior to the break. Gary says there's rumours that Arteta is the number one choice to succeed Eddie Howe at Newcastle, and there are more that are monitoring the situation. I would be very shocked, Gary, if A, he left, and B, if he went to Newcastle. So he's only just signed a brand new contract at the club this summer. So Arteta, I don't think is going anywhere anytime soon. So I don't think you need to worry about that at all, to be fair. Dancing Bear in the chat says, why do journalists not push Arteta to explain why the lack of transfer activity? If it's financial, it's his choice or the owners that are being tight. I don't think there's necessarily a need in October to be asking about transfers necessarily. Arsenal's injuries this season have been considerable. It's not like the transfer window is the reason why Arsenal are not picking up the points that they perhaps should have done, in my opinion. I think we've got a very good squad. And I think that, you know, we've still been able to bring in 3 players to the team outside of the goalkeeper Neto. You think about Marino, you think about Calafiori, and of course you think about Raheem Sterling coming in. We could have signed more, I'm sure, but if they didn't see the opportunity, if they didn't feel that there was an option on the market that was good enough to come in, then it's as simple as that. And I just think that they probably haven't asked because they don't feel that there's a need to ask. I don't really feel there's a need to ask that question at the moment. I think you can assess it in January, perhaps. You could assess it maybe more so in the summer. But I think Arsenal have got a deep squad that is suffering for a number of serious injuries to very key players. And that's the reason why Arsenal have dropped points. You look at the Bournemouth game, they played 60 minutes of that match with only 10 men, without Saka, without Ødegaard, without Martinelli being fit from the start. And of course, Saliba being the guy that was sent off was really damaging as well. So I just don't think there's necessarily a need to ask that question in October, because I just don't think it has too much relevance right now to Arsenal's situation. Freddie says, if you had to choose between Gyökeres, Šeško, and Isak, who would you go for? 100% Isak right now. You've got the Premier League experience. You've got a player who's still a very good age bracket going forwards. And with Gyökeres and Šeško, you've got I think more question marks about whether or not they could transition to the Premier League as successfully as Isak has. Isak's also got the versatility, so you don't necessarily have to drop Havertz. You can play Isak on the left-hand side as well and use Havertz through the middle if you have an injury to a Martinelli or you need to change things up. So I think there's a lot more benefits to go for Isak right now than going for Šeško. Damien says, it's a question that regarding transfers that someone doesn't really understand Arteta and how he responds to them. Also a very good point. If you ask Arteta about transfers, he doesn't tend to answer them, which is, again, another reason why perhaps journalists are not asking him the question at the moment. James says, Tom, does Partey have a 1-year contract extension in his current deal? As far as I know, I don't think he does. I'm pretty sure that his current contract runs out at the end of this season. He signed a 5-year contract in 2020 and it expires this summer. I've not seen or heard anything to suggest there's a 1-year extra. That's not to say that there definitely isn't, James, but I've personally not heard that story at the moment. Maximia says, hi, Tom. I hope your health has improved. I have still a little bit of a cough, but moving forwards, thanks for asking, mate. Is it true that Arsenal have collected video evidence of how offences like Saliba and Rice have been allowed to slide, like a case against the PGMOL? I've not heard anything about a case against the PGMOL, but I would be very surprised if after all of Arsenal's sending offs and all of the kind of strange yellow cards we've seen, if there weren't people at the club that are keeping a very close eye on the number of incidents that are going unpunished, should ever Arsenal want to present something. I don't know that, but I would be very surprised if somebody wasn't, of course, keeping track of these things. I know there's been some claims on social media that they are doing that. As I said, and I think a show a couple of days ago, I've personally not heard that at all. Alva Mod says, Tom, go back and check some of the performances from Isak and the national team and see if that changes your mind. I rarely look at international football as much of a gauge because it's just such a different environment to domestic and club action. So I don't imagine that watching the international side of things would change my mind. I'd look more at the domestic level. I'd look how he's playing with his teammates for Newcastle. I'd look how they're playing because, you look at, nations that have got players like Ødegaard, Haaland in Norway, and you look at how they've struggled in recent times. You look at other nations that have had some very good players and not necessarily performed to the level that you would expect. I think, despite England reaching a final, a semi-final, underachieved under Gareth Southgate, for example. I don't think he maximised the potential of that squad. And Arsenal, I always say that. And England, of course, should have gone on to win at least one of those tournaments with the squad that they had, with the opponents that they faced. So I tend not to look too heavily on the national side of things and instead judge them far more on their domestic action. And if you're basing it on that, Isak would be an excellent addition to this Arsenal squad. I'm 100% sure of that. Chulo says, have you heard any rumours about Kivior leaving in January? I'm not convinced by him. He lacks authority. Well, there were definitely links to him leaving the club in the summer, and there were links to Italian football, and I'd be very surprised if that interest hasn't persisted. I think it still certainly will be there, and I think that if there's a club that thinks that they can get him, and if Arsenal go out and add another defender in January, I think that Kivior is definitely one of those players who could still leave. Zuman UK says, what is the point of a pre-match press conference if coaches don't say anything? Well, of course, Arteta did say a lot. In fact, if you read the entire transcript from the press conference, he speaks a lot about a lot of different things, but you can't expect him to give you the exact dates of returns on certain players, on fitness. You can't expect him to give you inside knowledge on transfers, but that's why you kind of gauge how a manager answers questions, and then you have to start speaking to them and asking them questions in a certain way. For example, some managers will give more specific updates on transfers or on injuries than others. Speaking to Ange Postecoglou a couple of weeks ago, asked him about Richarlison. He was more than helpful in giving, more of a timeline about the Brazilian's return. But if you ask that about an Arsenal player to Arteta, he doesn't tend to give that type of question. But it would be remiss of a journalist at the start of those press conferences, especially ones of those from the likes of Sky and TalkSport, not to ask the question about team news, no matter how much, of course, that you are getting back. But of course, there's still reasons to ask questions. And if you read through the transcript, there's loads to get from that presser, and some still really good answers actually from some of the other questions surrounding the club, as well. I think he got asked a question around what if Arsenal lose on Sunday? What would that you know, what would that mean? And he gave a really good answer about, like, they don't really, you know, they're not considering that. They're not thinking about that. He says, I'm preparing to win games and not to lose it. And he says, I never think about what if we lose it. Everything that we do is to win. So my preparation, I don't spend 1 second if we lose it. It's about winning it, how convinced we are that we are going to win it, and then how we're going to feel afterwards. So questions like that get really good answers, you know, and that's why we have those press conferences. That is going to bring an end to today's show. Only a short one today, of course, because I am away. A massive reminder again to all of you that are outside of the UK that are not going to be dealing with daylight savings. Tomorrow's show, the clocks go back here in the UK. So even though the 8 a.m. show will be 8 a.m. here in the UK, it is going to be, of course, a different time for you people outside of that. So make sure that you are very much well aware of when that's dropping. Tomorrow's 8 a.m. show will be a preview for the game against Liverpool. Before you go, please make sure you drop a like on the video. Please make sure you subscribe to the channel if you're new around here as well, and turn those notifications on so you never miss a show. I'll be back with you after that day off on Monday to round up all of the action from the game against Liverpool. Stay safe, stay well, stay happy, respectful, and as always, up the Arsenal.